Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this discussion. I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. Thanks so much to WEF and the WEF team for the chance to partner on this discussion. We really have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the experience and expertise and perspective up here, and we also have what I think it's safe to say is the most complicated global security landscape in decades. I think Rubik's Cube, the title of this panel, is probably an understatement. So I'm going to get right into this with no real preface. You have bios for all of our 5 speakers. I should also say we're at, I think at the moment, at 3 of 5 who have written really fantastic pieces in foreign affairs over the last several months, and we'll hopefully add to those in the months to come, so I don't want to neglect to mention that. Let me start with Comfort Arrow. Comfort is the president and CEO of the International Crisis Group, which really for every conflict or potential conflict on Earth, both those in the headlines and those not in the headlines, does some of the most incisive analysis and provides some of the smartest, most constructive recommendations on what should be done. And so, Comfort, I want to go to you to give us a sense of whether the kind of broad impression we have of the security landscape really being more dire than it's been in decades, probably in our professional lives, looking at Sudan and Gaza in the Middle East and Ukraine and the kind of threat of great power war in ways that we really wouldn't have contemplated not long ago, have become front of mind. Just to step back and really give us a sense of how we've gotten here. When you look at the kind of post-Cold War security order and the hopes of that moment, Crisis Group was so central to those hopes, in that sense that peacemaking could really be a central part of the international system and a source of cooperation among powers. Why at this moment have we gone from those hopes to this landscape that's characterized by a number of really terrible wars and the threat of even more?
Thank you very much, Dan, and it's such a pertinent question, and really good that we're able to discuss this at the start of the year with Davos. I mean, as most of you in the audience will know, every year Crisis Group issues what it calls 10 conflicts to watch in association with foreign policy. And since I became president, Dan, but even I looked back at what my predecessors did, and never in the life of Crisis Group, our bread and butter is the off-the-radar conflicts, the ones that are not often in the headlines. So you've mentioned some of them, you know, the Sudans, the Haitis, the Myanmar, although credit to Davos for holding consistently the last few years a focus on Myanmar. But I've never, this is the first time that we've got a 10 conflicts to watch that really is being shaped by 2 factors. In fact, one is a symptom of it. So the big shaper of our 10 conflicts to watch this year is about big power rivalry, major power tensions, and how global politics itself is going in the wrong direction. I see Trump as a symptom of that, and it's also not a surprise that the Trump factor is really what has shaped our 10 conflicts, for example, this year. And in every single conflict that we've got on that list, bar Sudan and Myanmar, we expect to see a real shift in policy from Biden to Trump as well. The US may have a role in Sudan, given that it's often been a penholder, but we have serious question marks about that. So that's just one thing to say. And I think the headline for us this year is unpredictable, although which year wasn't unpredictable, but more unpredictable this year. We also said that it was a year of more lawlessness, that international law itself has already been battered the last decade and or so, but expect to see more lawlessness. And if you wanted an indication of that, Panama and Greenland, you can wake up in the morning and say, well, I want to take over your country, raises questions about where then stands international law. And I think the other concern is just what we are seeing a paradigm shift. The question is, which way is it going to go? Which way is the arc going to bend as well? There is a rest of the world out there that is not necessarily catastrophizing about this moment, that they see opportunity in transactionalism, that they see opportunity in a sense in that we're in it together now, that US, we're one amongst equals in this sense as well. I think the 3 things that keep me and worry me now, Dan, in terms of the future of the security order, is a sense in which there's a shock therapy for allies who are used to a collective deterrence architecture. what is going to happen to that deterrent structure. I think the other thing that worries me, and it's good to have Mr. Grossi on here, is the future of the nuclear proliferation, particularly when you look at it from the context of Russia, Ukraine. I think there may be opportunities vis-a-vis Iran. And I do think for an organization that worries about conflict prevention, suddenly I'm asking myself whether trade and tariff talks can help lower the temperature. Can you use that as a negotiating bargaining chip, or will it unravel and lead to miscalculations on the high seas as well? So lots to worry about. But I would also say that there are opportunities and innovations. The question is whether you can whether as you're striking a grand deal, that there is somebody in the room that enables it to stick. Because it's okay to strike a deal for today, but as we all know, the art of deal making requires you to also make sure that you're keeping an eye on the deal that you strike, that it actually yields the dividends that you want as well.
Can I ask you to just say a bit more about the Trump factor here? We're only 2 days into the administration, so all of this is a matter of reading tea leaves. But he, on the one hand, talks about himself as a peacemaker. You saw kind of extraordinary cooperation between the outgoing Biden team and the incoming Trump team on getting to at least the first phase of the ceasefire in Gaza. On the other hand, he has disregarded some of the, at least rhetorically, the core principles of the rules-based order, and talking about Panama and Greenland and embracing this sort of might is right principle. How do you see those dynamics playing out in Trump too?
I mean, look, at one level, Trump is erratic, throws bombshells on the table. And the question is whether you're ready to adjust to those bombshells and whether you can negotiate. What I've understood, and people like Meghan will have a better sense of this, is that he will go in with the highest sort of demand. So the 60% on China. But as we talk this week, Dan, he's already lowered the threshold as well. So thinking about what he can get, only a Trump could have invited a Xi Jinping to inauguration, and he sent somebody else. So again, I think there's opportunities if you can make a compelling case. The era of sovereignty is back. We are all sovereign. We are all going to be thinking from our own national interest, for narrow national interest. And every country has a clear view on understanding of their national interest. The other thing that is very clear to me is that it doesn't enable your cause to be weak in front of a wheeler-dealer. You're better off coming to the table with a clear sense of who you are, what you want. And anyway, these countries also have agency. I think the one thing that the other side always has to remember, a Trumpian kind of figure also needs to recognize that there are agents on the other side who have also a very clear sense of their national interest. There was an excellent article written in your magazine just recently that Asia is not necessarily worried or catastrophizing. And there's a clear sense of what their national security looks like. So I think there is something to take away about the art of deal-making from the other side of the table as well.
Let me go to Alexander Stubb. He's, of course, the president of Finland, a job you've held for a little more than a year. Finland is today really central to these questions in a way it would not have been just a few years ago. I imagine that's not a status you're particularly happy to have, but as a country with a very long border with Russia and also as a new member of NATO, has become a very interesting player in a lot of these dynamics. If we'd gone back even 5 years ago, or certainly before Trump's first term, and you looked at the transatlantic relationship and NATO, I mean, that seemed like such a kind of solid pillar of the post-Cold War order. That is no longer the case. We can get into some of those specifics, but I think it's worth stepping back to get a sense of, from where you sit, what this changing order looks like. You're a student of world order as well as, of course, a head of state. How do you see this shift?
Yeah, well, thanks, Dan. I kind of hope that it's not a Rubik's Cube, because it has 4 colors, 4 different sides, 9 squares, 43 billion different possibilities, and only one solution. So, it shouldn't be that complicated. But I think, Finland's predicament is pretty much part of a bigger change in the world order. My argument is that this is the 1918, 1944, or 1989 moment of our generation, without catastrophizing it. It's one of these moments when there's a big shift in world politics. And of course, after World War I, League of Nations wasn't strong enough, so they got it wrong. After World War II, the current liberal order, especially the creation of the UN, you could argue that they got it more or less right from some perspectives. And of course, in 1989, a lot of people in the West got a little bit lazy. You know, history didn't end. And then you can always, you know, have an argument about what was the date in the shift. Was it 9/11? Was it Lehman Brothers? You know, was it Brexit? Was it Trump 1.0? But in my mind, as a Finn, it was definitely the 24th of February, 2022. Now, of course, I could argue that, well, Russia did the same thing in Georgia and did the same thing in the Crimean Peninsula. But the bottom line is that the shift started at that stage. And if you really, really want to simplify things, which I think in international relations sometimes is useful, you could say that on one side you have a choice of, you know, multilateral order, a liberal order where you believe in international institutions, norms and rules. And on the other side, you have multipolar transactionalism, where, you know, the rule of the might is. And I don't say this only because I come from Finland, but I guess the choice at the end of the day is between Yalta and Helsinki. In Yalta, it was the big powers, the victors of World War I that carved up not only Europe and European security, but the world. Whereas in Helsinki, it was a new European security structure with three key principles, including independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And this is sort of the tension that we're dealing with right now. So a very complex world, but I still think manageable.
Let me drill down on the Ukraine dimension of this, because that has, of course, been one of the central questions about what happens in Trump's second term, given what he said and what J.D. Vance and others in the administration have said. And it's been obviously a central topic of conversation over the last couple of days here in Davos. What, as you look at the next year or so in Ukraine, do you see as a plausible, optimistic scenario, given the state of the battlefield and given the key players? And then if we look at, you know, what I think most Ukrainians would consider a more a less positive scenario, where you have some kind of peace forced on them by Trump and Putin and other great powers, what would that mean for European security and for Finland, given where you sit?
Well, first of all, I think the timeline is that, you know, 24 hours has become somewhere between 3 to 6 months. That's probably the window of opportunity that we are dealing with. I think on the optimistic and positive side is that Trump is very adamant about achieving peace. You know, and obviously he takes a lot of credit, and I would argue rightly so, for the situation in the Middle East. And he's probably looking to find some kind of a deal which is similar to that. The other positive side is that I don't think the American administration wants to lose this one. You know, it's very important to point out that this should not be an Afghanistan 2.0. And you don't want to be in a situation whereby after 6 months, when the deal has been done, the ones who were the deal makers are accused of basically, you know, selling out on Ukraine. So the starting point for us is no peace in Ukraine without Ukraine, and no peace in Ukraine without Europe, because essentially it's also about the European security structure. I hasten to add, I actually think it's about the global security structure as well, because if you're able to do territorial acquisition and power grabs like Russia is trying to do in Russia, that will happen everywhere. So then we are going to go really into a chaotic world. I still think that the situation on the ground is actually much better than we think. It's a war of attrition. Russians are not moving as far as they are. The collateral damage, of course, is huge. I also think that the Russian economy is in much, much, much worse shape than some pundits claim. And from this starting point, I think it's important to install into the thinking of Donald Trump and his administration, who are going to do the deal, and also to China, who can influence Russia, that the three key principles are still there: independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Independence, no one should ever question the independent state of Ukraine. Sovereignty, I don't think anyone should question the sovereignty of Ukraine to decide about NATO membership or about EU membership. Territorial integrity, I admit, more complicated, but I don't think we should give in on that either. So it's a complex package. I don't envy the Trump administration if and when they want to do a deal within 3 to 6 months, but I'm actually quite hopeful because Trump needs to come out of this one a winner, and I think he will.
Rafael, Grossi, let me go to you to pick up on some of the points that I think Comfort started with. You are, of course, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'd say both halves of your mandate, both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, are matters of extreme urgency at this particular moment, but I want to focus on the nuclear weapons half to start. There are so many signs that the non-proliferation order, again, another kind of central pillar of the post-Cold War and even before, the kind of global security order. There's so much to think that order is starting to fray. If you look at North Korea, you look at the debates over nuclear weapons in South Korea and Japan, risks in Iran, everything that has happened in Ukraine and Russia, the threats from Russia about nuclear use. As you look at non-proliferation order more generally, what are the fears that you're looking at? What are the dynamics that you see as a real threat to that order over the next few years?
Thank you, Don. It's getting worse. It's getting really worse. Some of the common denominators that even at times of conflict used to exist among, for example, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and other major European countries in terms of nuclear weapons and nuclear non-proliferation is simply no longer there. Times of increased geostrategic tension, unfortunately, like this, are increasing the attraction of nuclear weapons. We need to admit that that is the case. Even in Ukraine, where all debates about the wisdom of having relinquished nuclear weapons have been heard. Of course, wrong. I think it's very good that Ukraine joined the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state, but some have said, well, maybe had we had nuclear weapons, which we know was technically impossible and politically even more impossible, that would have been the case. We see the same in, of course, when it comes to the perennial, I would dare to say now, situation in the Middle East, and in particular with regards to Iran, where the continuation of this ambiguity and this status of presumed latency that Iran may have reached already, although of course they do not have nuclear weapons at the moment. They have a number of pieces of the jigsaw puzzle ready, while at the same time showing, continuous willingness to continue talking, although not getting or ever getting into a more stable place. So this also adds to the fact that while the Iran situation simmers and it continues to remain unresolved, other countries in the region, including a NATO ally, are saying if they get a nuclear weapon, we are going to get a nuclear weapon as well, or important countries. And they say it openly. I mean, it's not something that I'm not sharing any secret that I have because of my position. This has been said very clearly in the open. The consensus on the nuclear test moratorium is also being questioned now, with Russia de-ratifying the CTBT and discussions in the United States and elsewhere about perhaps the need to resume nuclear testing. And the same thing we see in Asia, where there is an open discussion in the Republic of Korea about the possibility of having nuclear weapons. And the same applies to Japan, not officially and not from the government, but many people discuss this with me when I go to Japan. The press come to me and they say, shouldn't we have nuclear weapons? Couldn't the current situation be expanded by adding 2 or 3 more countries? Wouldn't that add to global stability? So what we see, of course, is that adding to what has been described by my co-panelists as a situation of great concern, we have to add this enormous real pressure on one of the basic tenets of international life, I would say, which is the non-proliferation norm and the non-proliferation regime, which, warps and all, has been serving us well. You were saying you're watching, you're following 10 conflicts now. Imagine if all those 10, you had to add the nuclear weapon factor as we see it in other places. So for us, it's a matter of, first of all, recommitment, strong recommitment, especially of the big players, to the non-proliferation regime, strengthening the arm of the IAEA as the instrument that guarantees that that actually is the case.
Let me just linger before moving on to other speakers on the Iran piece of this, because I think that's probably the issue of most urgently and the one on which you're spending the most time these days. Iran is in an incredibly weakened state. Its missile capacity, its proxies have been degraded significantly over the past year or so. That has led to two, I think, somewhat conflicting ways of seeing the situation, or two tensions and two dynamics that are in tension. On the one hand, you could understand why Iran would want to rush towards a nuclear weapons capability, given where it is. It's much closer to that point than it was in the Obama administration when JCPOA was signed, or in the first Trump administration when the U.S. withdrew from JCPOA. On the other hand, there seems to be interest, at least that is so far as Iran is signaling it, in a deal. There could be a chance for Trump to come in and do something that he can sell as bigger and better and more beautiful than the original Iran deal. How close is Iran to moving towards that point? What signs do you see that it may be doing so? And what possibility do you see for a deal that would really stabilize us for the time being?
Indeed. Well, they don't have nuclear weapons. This is very clear, and we should not confuse people. At the same time, if we take as a line of departure, let's say 2018, when the JCPOA starts unraveling, and you compare 2018 with 2025, the nuclear program in Iran has spawned in every possible direction. So it is obvious that something like the JCPOA would no longer be fit for purpose, and you would have to think about something else. Of course, the principle, and this is something I discussed in Tehran with President Pezeshkian and Foreign Minister Arakchi, of course, the principle of the transactional nature, the philosophy behind JCPOA still would apply to an agreement inspired by President Trump, maybe, with the accompaniment of the European E3 that have been engaging with Iran even this month, a few days ago. But in any case, what we see is that we would have to move into a different kind of thing. The complicating factor, not an impossible factor, as President Stubb was saying, can be managed, but it's enormously difficult, is going back to my initial point about the lack of common denominators. In the past, when you were dealing with these issues, you would, albeit the great differences that might exist among the P5 plus Germany maybe, or the EU, or whomever actors you could have vis-a-vis Iran, there was a basic understanding. Not anymore. So this is a sea change that we have. So you're not going to be seeing all those on one side of the table, negotiating, some with more understanding and sympathy for the other guy. You're not going to be seeing that anymore. So we have to think about a different architecture, a different shape of the table. And in this, of course, we will have to, I think, as the guarantors of any agreement, have to be or should be playing a very indispensable role as the guardians of the NPT.
As we shift to the Prime Minister, let me just say that for those of you who need simultaneous translation, this is the moment to put your headsets on. Prime Minister, of course, of Libya's Government of National Unity in Tripoli. Your country has, for years now, exemplified as much as any other the challenge of both local actors and external actors trying to find some path to stability in a very complicated situation. I want to start with what is a fairly straightforward question, but one that hasn't had a very straightforward answer for many years. And that's the simple matter of what Libya's prospects are for moving past both its political stalemate, which has characterized the country for the last several years, and the economic effects, especially the central bank crisis that has made it so much harder to resolve. What is the state of the negotiations, the state of process for resolving that?
To begin with, I would very much like to thank you for the kind invitation to attend this session. Libya, since its inception as a state, has always been a country without any democratic institutions, unfortunately. Since its independence, post-independence, we had the royal monarchy for 17 years in Libya, and then from then they moved to a regime that cannot be defined. Even the Libyans themselves, they don't know the type of regime that has governed them for 40-plus years. At times it was democratic, at times it was autocratic, it was socialist, it was a blended. After the 17th of February, Libya moved to a different state, different situation, and therefore we realized that our country was absolutely geographically pivotal, important. It has a geostrategic situation, which is very important, but we did not have any laws, any legal frameworks, no institutions, and therefore we had these conflicts, whether internal or external. Many external actors intervened, especially neighboring countries, and even countries that are very far also intervened in our internal affairs. And therefore, we went through conflicting situations that literally devastated and caused the collapse of what was in Libya. So all the problems were there at the same time. I mean, you can think of any problem, and then we had it, and we have it still. We had polarization, political, military polarization, and today, for the last 3 years, we started work and we focused on one thing, which is the services for the population and stability. As a motto for our political stability, we said no more wars. We want stability and we have to provide services. For example, electricity. We had blackout for about 22 hours. Hospitals were closed. Schools were literally not operational. But today, thanks God, little by little, for the last through the national unity government, we managed to re-establish these institutions, these services, and the exchange rate between the dinar and the dollar has been more balanced. But today, the situation is not perfect. I have to tell you, the things are not rosy. But we managed to recover normal life somehow in Libya, and the challenge today in Libya, and I would very much like to thank the international community for backing us up. We have three, I would say, pillars that are important. Obviously, there are the challenges are very, very important. We have a military regime that wants to impose itself by arms, by weapons, and there is an ideological regime which makes of religion the motto to intervene, and we have the previous regime for 40 years who wants to come back to life, resuscitate in somehow and be in power again in different ways. And today we have, after having the security prevailing, we have to work on democratize the society. because I believe that democracy is the only solution, which is the respect of the different components in our society. There are powers who want to intervene. They want to impose their own agenda for many reasons. Obviously, interests of some external actors that want to impose their agenda on us. We cannot solve the problem of Asia, the problem of Libya, only from a security point of view. This is not the only intervention, I would say, process. We need to have different processes. We need to have democratic institutions. We need to have a true constitution that reflects our society, and we need to have a referendum to have that democratically set up a constitution. We have enough of weapons. We need stability to begin with. We need to support the economy, because the stabilizing economy is the way to stabilizing the political situation. We have oil, and therefore we want the foreign companies to come to invest in a win-win situation. And the more the economy is stable, the more we have a stable country.
Just one more minute, if I could, before we go to Meghan, on Donald Trump and what role he may play in resolving some of these during his first term. It's a rather complicating factor from your predecessor's perspective in his tacit support for some of the forces that were coming from eastern Libya. What do you worry about as you see Trump returning, and what do you think he may contribute to a solution? But again, just 60 seconds on this.
هو دائما أعتقد أن
I believe that not only Libya fears the return of Trump, many, including Europeans, are somehow having reservations and different views about how to perceive the return of Trump. We are somehow a weak country, vulnerable country. Our institutions are still weak. I mean, whether we talk about Trump or any other personality, if we only focus on security, this is not the best recipe to solve the problems we have. We have many examples, I mean, in Syria lately and Afghanistan, and we reject the idea that the only solution is security solution in our country. I mean, there are alternatives. We need to look into revive our heritage, our economic fabric. This is precisely what is going to be the building blocks leading to a long-lasting stability. If Mr. Trump or American administration or whoever is in charge, if they really genuinely want Libya to be stable, then they have to find other ways to help us, and not only the security path. Otherwise, we are going back to square one, unfortunately, and we have many, many examples that when the diagnosis is wrong, then the result is wrong. If we focus on the security only, this is going to backfire at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And that's a good segue to Meghan on Trump in the Middle East. Meghan Sullivan is director of the Belfer Center at Harvard, was deputy national security advisor on the National Security Council in the Bush administration, has done a ton of other jobs in the U.S. government. Meghan, looking at both the kind of urgent question of what happens with the ceasefire in Gaza, we're in the first few days of phase one, but the path to getting to phase two and a real sustainable peace are very complicated, and that intersecting with Trump's priorities in the region, the set of challenges that Trump is facing. How do you see both that urgent question of what happens in Gaza and in the war between Israel and Hamas going forward, and how that fits with Trump's priorities and likely actions in the region more broadly?
Sure. Thank you, Dan, and thanks for bringing this panel all together. I would say one of my takeaways from Davos, we're a day and a half into it, is how much optimism I have heard from many Middle Eastern leaders about President Trump coming into office. And I think that's really attributed to two things. First is the sense that President Trump does not make it hard to understand his intentions. So there's a lot of clarity in what is being said and what has been said by President Trump, and also a willingness to use American leverage to try to get to those outcomes. I also think there's a sense that there's almost like a reset moment for many leaders, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, that there's an opportunity to recalibrate their positions on certain things and be able to attribute it to greater pressure from the Trump administration to do so. So there's kind of a sense of opportunity. When it comes to Gaza in particular, I think, as President Schiff mentioned, that the Trump administration, or the incoming President Trump, does deserve some credit for this ceasefire that was achieved even before inauguration. I would point out what was proven was that President Trump was able to use leverage, and his envoy Steve Witkoff was in a good position and did a good job of, saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu, now is the time to make the deal. That's very different than negotiating the ins and outs and all the minutiae of the deal that was done over the course of a long period of time. So that will be another challenge there. In terms of the longevity of the ceasefire, you pointed out, Dan, that there are a lot of complex steps, and really the next step is that within the first 16 days of this phase one, there needs to start negotiations about phase two. And that is going to be complex because I think the Israelis understand that part of phase two would involve having a different governing structure in Gaza than Hamas. And if that's the case, the real question remains, well, who is going to be governing? And that will require some really intense negotiations and a lot of the use of leverage to get a particular outcome. Now, how can I be optimistic about this given the challenges? I would say that one point of optimism is that, as President Trump has taken a lot of credit for the ceasefire, he owns it now, which is a good thing. He's very invested in this being a successful outcome. There's also another component, and this gets to the part of your question about priorities. Of course, a Trump administration will have several priorities in the Middle East, but I would say President Trump's biggest priority for the Middle East is normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This he sees as unfinished business from his first administration, when you had the Abraham Accords, bring about a stabilization of relations between several Arab countries and Israel. And so this is really the big enchilada, the Saudi-Israeli normalization, and he is determined that that is realized on his watch. Obviously, Gaza is now an important component of that. It'll be extremely hard to have that normalization without a better outcome in Gaza, and that's good for the Palestinian people. And I think that's going to be another reason why there will be focus on Gaza by the Trump administration. The other priority, and I know we're short on time, so just briefly, of course, is Iran, and we talked about that. And there, I think it's going to be a challenge for the Trump administration to reconcile a variety of views within the administration. Some people very hawkish on Iran, seeing this moment of weakness as an opportunity to really press Tehran hard, and others, and probably including President Trump, more desirous of a deal, but not anything that would resemble the JCPOA. As you said, it's not fit for purpose now, but I think the ambitions would be much larger, that this would be a deal that would span Iran's behavior in the region much more broadly. And one thing I think will be different about this negotiation, if it does occur, there will be a much more a much stronger and I would say more credible threat of the use of force, which was, of course, part of President Obama's negotiation, but it wasn't a very robust component. It'll be much more robust this time.
Meghan, to close, I want to go to something that I think has been looming over this entire conversation, but we've referred to explicitly only a couple times, and that's the U.S.-China dynamic. U.S.-China competition has been sharpening really over the last 3 or 4 administrations, probably ever since you left government. That relationship has been getting worse. Almost 20 years ago. So much of the ability of various powerful actors in the world to resolve any one of these conflicts requires some degree of cooperation between the U.S. and China, and of course, the greatest fears we would all have of truly catastrophic great power war are really about U.S.-China tensions. As you look at the Trump policy and the U.S.-China relationship as it has evolved and deteriorated over the last several years, how do you see that playing out, both with regard to conflict resolution more broadly and in the U.S.-China context? I know it's a big question for 3 minutes.
Yes, that's true. One of the things in terms of understanding President Trump is just to look at the issues that he has repeatedly talked about for decades. And these are the issues that are going to animate his presidency in the second term. China is one of those issues in the sense that China has, in his own words, taken advantage, and actually in the words of many others, of its invitation into the global economy. And so I think that is, again, a preoccupation of President Trump. However, he is someone who likes to take on problems that the perception is that no one else has been capable of fixing. And so I think there's at least a possibility that he looks at the U.S.-China relationship and he says, well, there's one thing everybody agrees on, and that's the U.S. should be tougher on China. And I'm going to show everybody that that's not the case. And I'm going to take my personal relationship with Xi Jinping and try to change it into something different. And here I would say there's definitely scope for a better U.S.-China relationship, and that would behoove, the world, and it would be helpful in so many of these conflicts. I would say Ukraine, maybe more so even than the Middle East. However, I think there are structural issues in the U.S.-China relationship that don't lend itself to a tactical negotiation. These are issues like the technological competition, the race around AI, Taiwan. These are issues that will need to be managed. And for that to be done successfully is going to require the kind of really embedded, very hard slog kind of diplomatic relationships that the Biden administration achieved over time with the Chinese government. And that's extremely hard work and pretty unrewarding in some respects, but it's those kinds of dialogues that will keep this relationship more stable through the management of these structural challenges that don't lend themselves to negotiation. So I think we'll get a chance to see if the Trump cabinet is interested in making those kinds of relationships and able to maintain them. And if President Trump is interested in owning the whole U.S.-China relationship himself, trying to manage it just through a Xi-Trump relationship, which is more characteristic of his approach, or if we can have kind of a more multifaceted dialogue between the U.S. and China.
I have to say I'm surprised that I'm leaving this panel with a little bit more optimism than I came in with, not what I expected. But please thank our 5 speakers for that. This is one of the WEF panels that I wish were about 4 times longer, but I know 45 minutes is all we've got. So thank you all 5. Thank you all.
Well done. Well done.